Hello there. My apologies. I didn't realize it was time for another episode already. I must have spaced it. Seems like we were just here for episode 1, but welcome back to episode 2 of the Great Philosophical Abyss, where we're going to ask the question, at least I'm going to ask the question, I don't even know if you're there, is there anybody out there? In this episode, I'll begin by telling you, why I'm here. Why am I asking this question? I'll also try to say a little bit about why I think you should be here with me, which I think you're here with me right now, asking the same question, asking whether I'm not actually here or whether I am or I am not actually here. I'll introduce this fella named David Hume, who will present us with a case. Now, most of us, as Hume admits, we're going to answer, yeah, duh. But Hume's going to present us with a case against that position, try to convince us why, rationally speaking, we don't know that there's anybody out there. And at best, we can just imagine that there is. And again, while we might naturally always have that tendency to do so, which Hume says we can't help but have that tendency, it's not rationally defensible. And I'll finish by then, taking my own stance, getting off the philosophical fence and telling you what I think. Is there, in fact, anybody out there? So that's the plan here. I wanted to begin, I think it's best to kind of begin by, trying to make this as relatable to all of us as possible. And I think, given some points I'll make here, that it's easy to see that that is, in fact, the case, that this applies to all of us, this question, right? And that, as weird and as uncomfortable as Hume's skepticism might make us, and suggesting we have no good reason to think this is the case, nevertheless, that just because the truth isn't pretty, right, it might still be it is the case, right? And so, look, it might not be pleasant, it's going to be uncomfortable, but one of the things I'm going to argue or going to suggest is that actually one of the things we believe most fervently in, a lot of us, right, particularly those of us probably inclined to say, well, come on, obviously there's somebody out there. Science, okay? Think about science. Doesn't science suggest, right, it's all about this external world, and by anybody out there, right, we're implying and more generally speaking about, okay, this idea of external existence, external reality, something outside our individual, my individual perception of realities as it's unfolding to me phenomenologically by my own experience as I perceive it. Right, science presumably is all about studying, this objective world around us that presumably continues to exist independent of us, right? This notion that there's cause and effect, right? Science is all about studying cause and effect, trying to establish that at least, right? Which, as we'll see, this whole notion of cause and effect, that's very much tied to our implicit belief in the external world. Okay? So cause and effect, this idea that's, again, front and center for scientific endeavors typically, very much associated with this. And yet, okay, while Hume's going to give us good reason to doubt that world, so does, right? In other words, realities that seems to appear to us, he's going to give us good reason to doubt that. Well, so does science. Okay, you have faith in science, right? Well, science repeatedly tells us that reality is not how it seems to us. Okay, we perceive a purple flower, a TV, books, and so on. But what science is actually telling us is that no, what's actually out there is something we can't quite define yet that's emanating various wavelengths, various waves with various wavelengths, which then we are processing more or less bit by bit. And Hume's going to argue that's a very important bit by bit, moment by moment, And then we construe that, hopefully representing reality as it really is out there. We construe that then as purple flower, loud sound, and so on and so forth. But really, all that's happening is, or at least this is what the physicists tell us, right? All that's happening is we're processing these various waves coming at us at various wavelengths. A very different picture, right? The reality underlying its appearance is very different, right, than what it seems to us. Okay, so um, maybe it shouldn't come as a surprise, right? It shouldn't be. It should be much more palatable than to entertain the kinds of things Hume is going to suggest to us. And then, consider someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson. We've hopefully most of us have heard of this simulation theory, this idea that um, everything we are doing, right? It's not what it seems again, right? It's just nothing more than some sort of computer simulation. It's nothing real about it. Think again, the Matrix. Well, Neil deGrasse Tyson, one of the most popular contemporary scientists today, says there's a better than 50-50 chance that we're living in a simulation. Okay, how many of us go about our daily lives with this in mind? We don't think that way. No, instead, we think there's a reality out there, right? And this reality out there is objectively real, and remove us from the equation, right? It continues to exist independent of us. Well, the implication again of that simulation theory is no, that's not actually what's happening. Uh, Again, so even the picture that science is delivering to us, right, and the scientists are delivering to us, um, is suggested that the sense of reality we have a tendency to have, right, is oftentimes very misleading. And Hume gets into this, right? How precisely that, how we have all these psychological tendencies. And in fact, I'll get into Hume in much more detail here in a moment, but Hume thinks of himself as a kind of psychologist studying human nature, spelling out all these tendencies we have. We have this tendency, he says, um, to sort of impose these things and structure our experience in certain ways when we actually don't have any justification for that from our experience itself, and it can't be, as we'll see, rationally justified either. Okay, this will all make more sense here as we proceed, but I think again at the outset that it's of interest to sort of show that this should be relatable to all of us. Okay, science, something we hold up, most of us anyway. Okay, especially those who might be most inclined to suggest this kind of question is ridiculous, right? What? Come on, let's stay grounded here. Well, science is indicating something very similar, right? That we should be questioning reality as it appears to us, okay, on a day-to-day basis. And so, I've actually thought a lot about this. So, is there any question? I wrote, a lot of people don't know this about me, but I've written 3.5 novels. The last one, the fourth one, has been 15 years and going. So we'll see if that ever is finished. But the very first novel I wrote 20 years ago, look what it was called. So there shouldn't be any doubt that this is something that I've wondered about quite often. Shout out to Josh, one of my dear friends. I dug this out of storage and still have all your comments and constructive criticisms and whatnot. But this is something that I've clearly thought a lot about, and continuing, it's 20 plus years ago at least, but even up till recently, I am constantly thinking about what science has been telling us, especially like this idea of these waves and whatnot. Just in this room here, I didn't go to the library. This is just half the books I have in this room on, science and physics and so on. So, and just in the last few years, I've actually considered maybe pursuing a physics degree. It's of that much interest to me. But I'll just I have a notebook where I'll just make little doodles and reflect philosophically on these kinds of ideas. Is it just wavelengths and what are the implications of that and so on. So there's an example, right? Again, this is something I drew maybe a few years ago, and this idea that everything is just wavelengths coming to us, and then really, kind of emphasizing similar, trying to again kind of nail down this idea that we're just, again, these wave processors, more or less, and that ultimately, what is the difference between a loud sound, an impression of a loud sound, and the color purple? Is it really just this in reality? That's what I mean. I could be misunderstanding some things here, but that seems to be the implication here, from what physics is telling us. And again, that's at the very least, it's completely different than how it seems to us in the appearance of it. And by the way, Bertrand Russell makes that distinction. I like that, and I've used that a lot. Appearance versus reality. Um, all of this again is just very much indicative of how different they can be. And how do we ever know, right, what this reality is really like when the appearance is what we have, how things seem to us. That's really all we have. Can we get out of that? Anyway, another doodle where I represented kind of me going through life, right? And I have these various wavelengths that I'm then processing. Green grass, loud sound is in there, I think, somewhere. Red car, Sophia, my daughter's voice, right? Is it really just the difference in wavelengths? It seems to us, I don't know, that there's more going on there, but, uh, and then again, just capturing that idea in general, appearance versus reality. Okay, so, um, you know, what's really going on, science tells us, okay, is we get this input, these various wavelengths, okay, and then our output, what our experience tells us, okay, how things appear at least to us, is, hey, this thing there's a loud sound coming from this direction, so to speak, a TV over here, and so on and so forth. Um, yeah, interesting. And then actually, have it on my mind here. So where is it? So I had right, this paper. So I'm again going on about David Hume here in a moment, but he's one that I've encountered many years ago. But I wrote this paper on Hume. What is that? 2006, about this very question. And then I read him maybe for a few years after that, but I probably haven't actually read David Hume for at least 10 years. Okay? And yet he's made such a profound impact on me that it's been probably like 12 years at least. That even in my doodles in the last few years, here I am incorporating Hume and what he says, and then trying to kind of incorporate it with what recent science has been telling us. Anyway, so again, this is something that I've certainly wrestled with quite a bit, and I would say that it would be in our interest to recognize all of us, right? Probably have asked these sorts of questions, and then really should be, right, given what science is telling us as well. So, is there anybody out there? Let's see. So, I mentioned I wanted to give a little bit of background for my being interested in this question. So, Hume. So I mentioned, like, obviously something I've been interested in for many years. This goes back probably. I meant to say this in episode 1. If you think about it, right? If you can't even answer why there's something and not nothing, that kind of opens the floodgates. I mean, if you can't even explain why existence even is, then what question's off limits? I mean, I'll entertain any theory, so to speak. I mean, not, it'll have to pass the test, so to speak. I'll analyze it critically and so on. But what I'm saying is, I'm going to be a lot more likely to entertain certain ideas than maybe other people would be, because I can't get an answer to the most fundamental question of all. And so, not surprisingly, again, this has been something that's been of particular interest to me as well. If I can't be certain of why existence even is in the first place, how do I know any of these other things? Like, is there this stuff out there to begin with? We have this sort of work with this implicit notion that there is, or at least most of us. We have this idea that there is this external existence, that when we die, there's a reality that continues to happen, right? Independent of us. But what Hume's going to suggest is, on what basis? You have no good rational defense of that position because you've had no impressions, no experience that actually justifies it. And so he's going to argue ultimately that we must be imagining that this external stuff actually continues to exist independent of us. Okay? We have no other justification for it. Okay. So Hume, going back to Hume, I did encounter Hume earlier than grad school. Going back probably in high school, definitely in undergrad. He's probably a lot more known for his actually he's a skeptic in general, particularly with he's known for his skepticism regarding religion. He's probably more well known for that, but he's skeptical with respect to almost everything he talks about. He questions all these different aspects. And so he might be again more well known for his writings on religion, his dialogues. Very very clever. I've always found him fairly convincing in a lot of what he says. It's hard to argue anyway, in my mind, with a lot of what he says. So I've been familiar with him for a long time. But what we're going to be getting into the deep water, so to speak, really really deep stuff, that comes out in this mammoth treatise of human nature, where this is arguably the most difficult stuff there is in philosophy, which is going to have all kinds of implications for this episode, actually, and I'll get into those in more detail here. But back in graduate school here at the University of Kansas, that's when I really dove into Hume. I mean, you can just see how intensely I worked, on understanding, trying to figure out what he's up to here. I was looking through here. I should have marked the page, but there was like a page that was blank, and then the next chapter started, and it was like an entire diagram. I tried to just kind of map out exactly what he was saying. And here's one. And that reminds me, in one of my lectures, I think it was on Kant, I alluded to just how difficult it is to understand what Immanuel Kant is saying. And I tried to relate to the students that relate to them that I can sympathize because I had several similar experiences, and specifically I have a very vivid memory of, again, I took a graduate class at the University of Kansas on David Hume. Very vivid memory, impression, you might say, of trying to understand just one paragraph for literally hours from this book, and you can tell again just how much time I spent wrestling with trying to figure this out, and it is incredibly obtuse and difficult to flesh out because I think in part it does go against so much our typical psychological tendencies, right? The way we tend habitually to view the world, as Hume points out. I think that is what makes it even more difficult for us to kind of follow along with what he's saying. So, in view of that, I do want to recognize just how difficult some of the stuff we're going to be talking about is, and to understand, the points Hume is making. And honestly, some of the things I'm going to allude to, like for example, saying, that we can't know this exists, they deserve entire episodes themselves, and probably will get entire episodes. What is knowledge? What does it mean to know something? Never mind what do I know? Do I know anything? Right? What does it even mean to know something? There's been notorious debates about that very issue. And again, I don't have time. We gotta get to what matters for this question. I don't have time to flesh out, why I'm working with the conception of knowledge that I am. I'm just going to note, again, hopefully down the road I'll get to flesh some of these things out in more detail, right? But I'm just gonna have to note, again, for the sake of time, that I'm working with certain conceptions, and I'll have to defend those elsewhere. And for the most part, I should say, I'm going to point out a few of these. They're basically just what I would say the same way Hume is viewing these things. And it's funny, I should mention, I mentioned in the episode 0, right? What is the great philosophical abyss? that typically these episodes would be shorter. They'd be more off the cuff, and then I wouldn't really come with like, lecture notes like I do for the lecture videos. But, given the nature of this, that's not going to be the case for this episode. It's going to have to be, much longer in length. And, I came with a lot more notes just because I want to be sure that I'm meticulous and covering, point to point to point. Otherwise, it's very easy again to get off track here. I debated how far again to get into some of this stuff, but I'm going to try to keep things as simple as possible, and I will again try to have separate episodes for some of these topics. For example, you know, do I know anything at all? What is knowledge? Of course, to be able to answer the question, do I know anything at all? You'd have to be able to flesh out first what it means to know something, right? So very important questions. Arguably, you should flesh that out, what it means to know something, before you ask any other questions, right? Because how can you ask them or answer them, try to answer them, if you don't know what it means to have an answer and to know something, right? So, incredibly important question itself. Uh, but for what it's worth, I'm going to use knowledge in the same sense as Hume, okay? That it entails certainty. And I've always kind of felt this way intuitively myself. There's these philosophical debates about, again, what it means to know something. But to me, it always sounded odd to suggest you know something if you're not certain of it, right? In what sense did you know it then? If it could have been some other way, right? You weren't certain that it was going to be the case or is the case. And that seems to be the way that Hume um, works with the idea of knowledge, right? It entails a sense of certainty. And so when he says we can't know that this exists, right? That there is such a thing, and so really the upshot is that we shouldn't even be making a distinction. There's just existence, Hume's going to say, but you know, there's no, we can't know that there's anything that continues to exist independently of us, right? Because we can't be certain of it. And one of the ways he's going to ask us to sort of see that is going to be to suggest um, you can imagine that there is not an external reality, right? Give him his position. There is no external reality, and your experience won't change one bit, right? If everything does stop the second you die, right? Everything was just in your head, you wouldn't know any different. And that's his point. It could have been that way too, right? So who are you to say you know that exists, that there's some sort of other existence that's when you die is going to continue to exist independent of you? So that's the way we're going to work with knowledge in this episode. To know something means that you're certain of it. And that's tied as well to the idea of what it means to be rational, okay, in this episode, and what Hume means by it, at least I would argue, when he says something's rational or not rational. When you are suggesting it's rational, you're saying it couldn't have been any other way. Okay? If something's rational, we're saying that it had to necessarily be the case. So it's again, it's kind of like reasoning to a conclusion in a valid deductive argument. The idea is, if you're saying it's rational, it's not possible for it to have been otherwise. Okay? And so he's going to say, again, same sort of idea. It is possible, okay, for us to suppose that there's not this external existence, and thus the belief in it, that there is nevertheless external existence. He's going to say it's not rational. Okay? It's not necessary, particularly again, given that we don't have, he's going to argue, and we'll see this as we continue, any actual impression of an external reality. Okay? Rather, our actual impressions always depend on our own impressions of them, right? By definition. Okay, so hopefully this will make a little bit more sense as we proceed. But at this point, I'm just trying to make clear what I'm meaning by these terms, knowledge and rational. Okay, there's this element of necessity, right? It couldn't have been any other way, right? That's the sense in which you say you know it, and it's rationally defensible. Okay, and also then I guess hopefully this is clear at this point, but what we're questioning in the first place. Is there anybody out there? I could have said too, are there any bodies in general? Stuff, right? What we have, he's going to say in reality, is just a discrete impression, 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 right? That relies on our own perception, right? Our reality, right? It's always contingent on our individual perceptions of it. And what we're positing here is that there's something else besides that. Okay? Remove us and our individual perceptions, the perceiver, us the perceiver, and there's still other things happening, right? Other kinds of another type of existence out there. And really, I think what's at the what's being debated here is really this, in essence, the idea of dualism, the notion that there is a distinct kind of reality other than our phenomenological experience of reality. There is something else. And Hume's going to say that we can only define this like by sort of negatively by saying what it's not, because we have no actual experience of it. He's going to say, right? So it's not, right. What is this? It's not our actual, individual impressions of reality, right? Because again, what we're saying, what's implied here is that there's something else. That's what we mean to indicate by appealing to this in the first place, not our actual individual interrupted impressions, right? We're saying remove those, is there anything left? And that's what we mean to imply by this. And that's what's implied in the notion of dualism as well, that there's something distinct from the perceiver, right? That there's another type of existence. So, this often gets couched in terms of spiritual, mental existence, and then, there's a thought that there's this physical, material existence. And oftentimes implied in that is, again, a belief in an external reality, right? Wherein that those objects and those things continue to exist, again, independently of us. Okay, and what really I'm going to suggest where Hume ends up, okay, is kind of just suggesting we have, and I would say this represents what? Probably, I don't actually know the number here, but a lot of us, right? A lot of us believe this sort of thing, that there is, say, a mental type of existence, right? Or whatever we're perceiving, how we're perceiving it in here. And then there's a physical sort of existence. Okay? Something that isn't tied to that necessarily, right? And that's what he's going to try to suggest is unfounded. Now, some of you might be saying, well, I'm a materialist, right? Especially if you're, a scientist maybe, or you have a high degree of faith in science. Maybe you are one who says, well, I'm a materialist. And, again, implicit in that oftentimes is this notion that, again, that we're not that important to our experience of reality, or true reality, I should say, right? That remove us from the equation. And there's this material realm that continues to exist, right? Again, he's going to say you don't have any foundation for thinking that either, since every impression of reality you've ever had depended on you. That's going to be the crux of everything Hume's going to say, is we don't actually have any impression of this kind of existence that can continue to exist without us. We've never had an impression of it. Okay? And so that, again, the idea is, I would argue what he's saying here would equally apply to those who aren't dualists, but would label themselves as materialists or physicalists. And materialism not in the hoard wealth sense, but all that there's one type of existence, and it's physical. It's stuff, and I'm just part of that stuff. Remove me, and that stuff just continues to exist. Whether or not you want to couch it in those terms, any theory or any idea where there's a suggestion that remove me, the perceiver, from the equation, and there's a reality that continues to exist independently. That is what Hume's going to address and going to suggest is unfounded. Okay? And so we'll see his argument here in a little bit. I want to talk, before we get into his case for his position, though, a little bit more about who Hume was. I mentioned this earlier, so, by the way, so obviously, very interested in Hume, okay? Had a lot to say. He considered himself, and I think I mentioned this before, first and foremost, he reminds me a lot of Nietzsche in this sense. First and foremost, a kind of psychologist. Now, of course, psychology wasn't around in Hume's day. So Hume, born 1711, died in 1776. Um, but he would be one who would presumably label himself a psychologist, maybe more so than a philosopher if he were around now. He's explicitly interested in human nature, telling us sort of like the tendencies we have, and also speculating oftentimes on the why. So what are our tendencies? What are our habits? What kind of goes on without us even seeming to be conscious of it? And then, he has some things to say regarding why that might be the case. But definitely reminds me of a psychologist, sort of digging into how we work as humans. Um, he's known, again, for his skepticism. I mentioned that earlier. The one thing that really is admirable to me, though, is so skepticism, right? He questions things. Okay? He doesn't just take what's given, or as oftentimes happens in philosophy, take what's given by the norms of your society, and then just couch them in slightly fancier terms, but just justify the same beliefs. No, he really questions them, right? And oftentimes will defend um, a counter position. But not only is that impressive, it's one thing to do that nowadays, but he was doing it back in the early 18th century when you say the wrong things, you could still be put to death, right? So there's some degree of courage at play there as well, which I think is again admirable. So definitely known for his skepticism, and for whatever it's worth, again, one of my favorite philosophers, just because of his willingness to question everything, a la Socrates, and um, notably at a time when doing so was dangerous. Not only influential. Now, I was questioning this sort of thing before I encountered him, a long time ago, as I mentioned. Um, but he's clearly been significantly influential on me. As I mentioned, I'm still doodling about him, and I haven't actually read him in maybe 10 years. But in addition to being hugely influential on me, he's been significantly influential on a whole host of philosophical figures since him. I mentioned Kant earlier, most notably in Kant, who famously says that Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumber. So basically meaning he was just going about life like everyone else, all of us for the most part, until he stumbled upon Hume, who kind of made him question all of reality in some sense and the existence as he'd known it. It woke him up, so to speak. Um, and so, in fact, Kant's entire project, you might say, and Kant is just as prolific of a writer as Hume. His entire project, you might say, is aimed at saving uh, science and metaphysics and seemingly all of existence from space and time, notably from the grips of Hume's skepticism. So, in some sense, you could argue almost everything Kant has to say is in response to Hume. And Kant's just one example, and then indirectly, then everyone responding to Kant is kind of responding to Hume, and so on and so forth. And seemingly everyone is saying something in response to Kant. So it seems uh, that it would be the case then, right, that everyone is still talking about Hume. So very, I exaggerate a little bit there, but you get the idea. Very influential, not just for me, but for many, many people. Um, before we actually kind of get into his case, I do want to make an important point that Hume himself makes, which I think it's interesting just how frequently he makes this point actually throughout all of his skeptical arguments. I should say in the deep waters, right? I don't know that he necessarily makes this kind of point with respect to his skepticism on religion or God, um, but he's very careful to say, look, it's one thing to talk about what can be rationally or logically or philosophically defended, or in other words, what seems speculate about what seems necessary and to speak to that. That's another thing to talk about what we have to do to get by and to exist in our everyday lives. Okay, and so look, the point is, it doesn't matter what I or David Hume or any philosopher particularly if he or she is a skeptic, says about reality, and it doesn't matter whether in fact maybe it's true. Maybe there is nobody out there. You still have to put food on the plate. You still have to feed the family, right? Or at least act as if there really is somebody out there, because your reality seems to suggest that's the case, at least, right? So he's very careful to distinguish. It's one thing to question this stuff philosophically and to think about it, what's really the case. And it's another thing to act practically, right, and talk about what we have to do to get by. Right? And relatedly, it makes the point that, look, it doesn't even kind of matter whether we recognize that. Hopefully, we do recognize that those are two completely separate issues. Right? But he says it doesn't even matter because this is so naturally ingrained in us. These ideas of space and time. Actually, I should put time first. Because he thinks it comes first. Okay. So really, our question is about this specifically. Okay, but that, of course, is predicated on another sort of illusion, he would say, time. It doesn't matter whether we question it or not. It is so naturally ingrained in our psychology and the way we perceive the world that it's on par with breathing. You can hold your breath, try to, you can hold it for a while, but sooner or later you're going to take a breath, right? And he says you can try to suspend your belief through skepticism and through reading Hume for a while, right? But the next day your alarm clock's going to go off, you're going to go get up, go to work, and so on, right? You can only suspend it. In other words, you can only be skeptical, truly skeptical about this for so long, and you won't be able to help it, and you will be going right back, and you'll be to that assumption, right, and that belief that there is this external existence that continues to exist independently, whether you're here or not experiencing it. Again, it's such a psychological tendency in our human nature that we can't get rid of it. Seemingly, seems to be the argument. Okay? So I thought that was interesting as well. It doesn't matter what our response is here. We're going to just keep assuming that there is somebody out there. I guess that kind of makes sense. What would happen if we didn't? I mean, would we all end up in asylums? I guess that would be the upshot, right? So thank you, Hume, for keeping us grounded throughout this, right? Reminding us, don't lose your sanity according to the world as it seems, right? If you want to keep getting by and avoid that asylum, right, you have to proceed as if there in fact is somebody out there. Although there's no reason to think so. Okay. So before we get into the case he presents for his answer to this, let's spell out, what is the position. To be clear, it's what I would refer to as, you might say metaphysical idealism. So neither of these. Basically, the idea that all we can be certain of, and I don't even know if I like the commitment to idealism because, as we'll see in a moment, the only thing Hume wants to say we can be certain of is the moment in itself. And the very idea of time, as if there's a continuation between moments, is illusory. And I think a lot of idealists will still hold on to that idea. And so, what's his position going to be? Skepticism regarding both of these. Okay? We have no rational defense. It is not necessary. Doesn't have to be the case, right? That there is this external existence that continues to exist independently of us. Hence, we have it's not a necessary conclusion, right? It can't be rationally defended in that sense. And I don't think that's worded quite right there, or I've phrased that quite right. And it's stronger than that. That'll come out in what we say. But the same point then applies to time, what we say here in a few minutes. But the same will apply then to time as well. We don't have any actual impression of a connection between our impressions, right? We just have these discrete impressions, bits, if you're thinking in terms of processing, right? That's all we actually ever have, right? We don't have an impression of connection, and we don't have an impression of something outside of our impression, right? Which is what this is by definition. And so we can't reasonably infer that they exist either, because that's kind of one way to look at it, is because we we have to use reason, he's going to say, from our impressions and what seems necessary from our original impressions. And since we didn't actually have an actual impression, this will become clear why he thinks this, actual impression of either of these, then we can't rationally defend them either. And he's going to argue the only option left is that we constantly imagine them, that we kind of impose them on our existence and our experience. But they're not, we just automatically suppose they're there or that they're the case, but we have no impression of them still and no rational justification for them. So we're constantly imagining them, is what he literally says. Okay. So again, for all we know, with certainty, external reality doesn't exist. There is nobody out there or anybody's bodies out there, right? No stuff in general or individual things that continue to exist independently of us. Again, think of it this way, right? We can, for the sake of argument, give him his position, and our experience wouldn't change, right? If we suppose that there is no continuation between our impressions and that there is no external existence that continues to exist independently of us, nothing would change about our actual experience, Hume says, and that's why they're not necessarily necessary and hence rational. It's not rational to suppose they're the case then, is what he's going to suggest. So we cannot surmise with certainty from our experience, from how things actually are to us, that external reality exists, that there's anybody out there. All right. Now let's put on our thinking caps. Stay with me. Let's try to follow along with Hume and figure out why he thinks it's the case that we only imagine there's somebody out there and that I'm actually not here, or at least you have no rational justification for thinking that I'm here outside of your perception, that this is happening, right? That this would happen, right, if you weren't here. Let's dive into that. I should have kept that up there. Let me pull those back up. Okay, and do note that these are in an order, okay, for Hume, as we'll see. These are based on sort of what ends up happening is two, again, psychological tendencies we have, and they happen in this order, okay? So I just wanted to point that out from the outset that this happens first, and because of sort of what's implied in this tendency of ours to suppose that our impressions are connected, we then also suppose, sort of, it becomes automatic, sort of, along with this, that there's that our impressions are also indicative of some sort of other independent existence that again exists independent of us and continues to exist independent of us. Okay. So he's going to get into each of those psychological tendencies and in that order, and try to show again why they're not rationally founded and why they're not actually based in our actual experience. Now, the key to understanding these moves and what Hume's up to here is to understand at a basic level his fundamentally reductionist ontology. And again, this is rooted in what he thinks we can know with certainty. What can we know with certainty? The moment, only what's in this moment, right now. The moment now, the moment now. This moment, okay? Because even if you think of it in terms like memory, well, what about, can I be certain of a moment ago? Well, it seems like you can, right? But we all know how memory is in general, right? The further back we think we know something happened back in the day, well, the more likely it actually didn't happen or didn't happen that way. And so to some degree, right, even our memory, right, is something we can question to some extent. Bertrand Russell famously suggests, well, how do you know? For all we know, there was like an evil genius who created the world 5 minutes ago, along with everyone in it and all their thoughts and supposed memories. How could you, as crazy as it seems, how could you demonstrate that that wasn't the case? The only thing we can be certain of, and this is the key to understanding Hume, right? That we know is the case is this moment right now. Something's happening. I'm having an impression, feeling of hot, sight of sun, you know, sound of, loud sound. I think I hear a loud sound. Right? It's moment by moment, and that is all we can be certain of. But what then ends up happening, right, is and so that's really all we can sort of rationally defend in terms of being certain. But what ends up happening is we kind of go along as if, right, we know all these other things to be the case, right? And suppose, or at least suppose, to the point where it seems crazy to question that they actually exist. Suppose that these are actually the case, right? So again, so keep that in the back of your mind. Right? It's similar to, should I point this out now? Again, this is so difficult, right, that I had to appeal to some children's books here, right? Take the idea of, we're all familiar with an animated movie, okay? What's happening is similar to the animated movie. What's happening with existence is similar to what happens when we go into a theater and watch an animated movie. What in reality are distinct images being presented to us, it comes across to us, and the way we experience it is as if it's fluid, right? It's one continuous presentation. He's saying the exact same thing is happening with us. What we actually have is a distinct impression, but they're happening so fast sometimes that we lose sight of that. And so we immediately sort of assume that they're connected, right? Because they're happening so fast, and we view them as being fluid, as being connected. Again, much like an animated, you get the idea. You probably all have this in mind, right? But the idea is you flip a very similar looking image, you flip it fast enough, and what'll happen then is, it'll seem as if it's just one image, right? And that's what's happening with us, is basically the upshot of what Hume wants to say. And when we're imposing time on our experience, that's what's happening. Time's not really there. The connection's not really there. We're imposing it. And what we actually have are those distinct um, bits or impressions, right, that they were processing. To get, I think, so that's what's happening in general when it comes to time. But I think I meant to start with this as a specific example. I've alluded to this, I think it was in episode 1, actually, Hume and how he talks about our notion of causation and how that's not actually rationally justified, our belief that there is such a thing as cause and effect. He's going to say, look, we actually have no impression. So causality, this idea that there is, cause, one thing that causes an effect, right? Another thing, right? And that things are connected, this idea of connectivity. Right? That this thing causes this thing, right? And so on and so forth. He says, look, we actually have no impression of that, and I'll give you an example in a moment. Okay? And he's going to say, we can't reason to it then, since we don't have an impression of it. It's not something we rationally come to based on our impressions or any experience we've had. So it's not rationally defensible, or it's not something you can infer rationally from experiences you've actually had. So it must be imagined. You must be just imposing it out of nowhere, right? Habitually, all the time. And so so this is meant to indicate our impressions that are in the moment, right? What we're actually experiencing, what is the case. And then also, in some sense, our memory of those, okay? But of course, that's somewhat problematic, as intimated earlier. So what he's saying, so take cause and effect, this idea of causality. He's saying, look, we actually have no original impression of it. All we have are these distinct things happening or impressions. We have no impression of an actual connection between those impressions. And so too, then we can't remember any such experience. And again, it's not something we can sort of rationally infer from our experiences. So we must be constantly imagining it. So to give you an example that I think is kind of kind of intuitive actually, and it kind of makes sense, it seems like, and or at least has always helped me relate to what Hume's up to here. Um, Take, for example, um, the first time a child sees a needle. And of course, um, maybe hopefully you can at least imagine this, right? If you don't actually have or can't have that experience, right? But they're not going to anticipate anything. There's no sense of dread. They see a needle, right? Then maybe they feel pain, an entirely distinct, carefully Hume's going to point out, distinct, different impression, okay? And next time, they're not gonna, the second time they see a needle, unless it was egregious, like, it was a terrible, terrible, terrible experience, they're probably not going to necessarily anticipate anything, have a sense, of dread or anything. But then they will feel pain when they get the shot. Okay, but then what ends up happening? Over time, through experience, through repeatedly being conjoined in their experience, or seeming to be repeatedly conjoined in their experience, what happens is, excuse me, they begin to anticipate. Of course, this is way down the road, right? They begin to anticipate then, merely upon seeing the needle, right? And if you have kids, you can relate to this down the road when this ends up happening, right? All you got to do is, or they see the needle, or you talk about the doctor's office, and already crap's hitting the fan, right? They're extremely anxious, don't want to go, so on and so forth. And then right, because they're anticipating an effect, right? But what Hume is pointing out is that if we actually had an impression of the cause effect, the connection, right, the causality, we should have expected, right? If we actually perceived that they're connected, perceived that causality, it should have been immediate. Why wasn't that child, okay, if that was involved in the impression itself, some sort of connectivity to this, why didn't the child immediately, right, experience discomfort upon just seeing this, right? They didn't, because they didn't actually have an impression of this being connected necessarily to this. Right? It's only through repeatedly being conjoined, these two distinct impressions, through experience, right? Through repeated experiences, that then, right, they start to be sort of imagined, right, and projected. And what ends up being imposed then is that, oh, well then, since it's happened so many times, it must be the case that the one causes the other. Okay, but we don't actually have that impression of this, right? We don't actually have the impression of the connection, of the causality. Otherwise, we would have expected, again, the child to react immediately upon the first time being exposed to the needle and having that other sort of anticipation, or that the anticipation of that other sort of experience and dread. Okay. Another example that has always kind of helped me, I think, again, it's been a while since I've actually dug into Hume and read him, but I think this might be one of his examples, is, you can imagine somebody saying, well, look, I can make my right arm move, right? I'm causing it to move. See? And so desire, feeling, whatever you want to call it, to move arm consciously. You have that. And then it's like, hey, look, right arm moves. But what Hume says, what we don't actually acknowledge and recognize, is that, again, you're not actually perceiving, you don't actually have an impression of the causality. What you have an impression of is this and this happening, but clearly there's all kinds of other intermediary things happening as we've come to know by way of science. Think, for example, neurons firing. We have no impression of that, or what's going on physiologically to make all that happen, right? We have no impression of that. And if there was such a thing as cause and effect and causality, you would say, you'd have to have an impression of whatever it was that directly preceded that, right? Not something that happened like 20 moments before. So you're conscious of what you're conscious of couldn't have directly made that happen, right? Even though it seems to be that way. Okay? So this, I don't know how well this is coming across, but this is kind of how Hume tries to argue for this. And so, since we don't actually have an impression of the connection or the cause and effect, the truly cause and effect nature of this notion that that right, this actually does cause this. We just suppose it does, but it's not necessary, right? We don't actually know for certain that they are connected. Right? Who's to say that no matter how many times these are paired, right? One time you're presented with a needle and you won't feel pain. So in what sense does the needle cause the pain? Right? So it doesn't matter how many times something is seemingly conjoined in our experience either. You would argue that doesn't give you or suggest you had an impression of them being necessarily connected. Okay, so you didn't have an actual impression ever of our impressions being connected, right? Of causality, or connectivity, and more generally, this idea of time. You've never had an impression of. What you actually have, if you slow things down enough, are distinct impressions. Even when you view the sun and you're inclined to say, isn't this a constant, continuous, fluid viewing? No, insofar as things are registering, as insofar as things are making an impression, it's bit by bit. It's sun, I'm seeing the sun. And again, it might be happening. We're really fast processors. It might be happening so fast, but that doesn't mean that it is necessarily connected and that it is continuous. But rather, he's going to say again, it's still these discrete, distinct individual impressions. Okay? Same thing with the sun in general. He talks about viewing the sun every morning and so on. He talks a lot about how this sense of constancy, right, and things being generally the same over time, how that also then leads to this notion of time, right? But because we sort of there must be something continuous about it, right? It seems so similar, and the idea of identities, right? Of there being again this whole notion of something continuing to exist through our experience, right? It has it's one and the same throughout, right? It's connected somehow, right? Again, it's the same sun that we're perceiving every time, but is it? I mean, technically, it's really not, right? It has slightly less of a particular gas, slightly more of another, and so on and so forth. So again, he's trying to explain why it is we have this tendency, again, to think of there being a sun that continues to exist, right? Even though what we actually have are distinct individual perceptions of it. Right? So we are imagining, look, we have no actual impression of time, okay? And we can't because we have to work with what we have impressions on, in actual, what we've actually experienced, right? We have to work with that in terms of what's rational, right? And we don't have any actual impression of our impressions being connected to one another. So how can we actually defend it? And furthermore, right, you can suppose that they're not connected and your experience is going to be no different because in fact they're not, he's going to say, right? They are distinct. And so it could have been different. There was nothing necessary about supposing that they are connected. And it's in that sense in which something's rational, right? It has to be necessary. Well, there's nothing necessary, again, about this supposition of time. So insofar as we nevertheless have it, right, it must be something we're imagining, imposing, not through reason or through any actual experience, but imposing somehow through our imagination, he says. Okay. Let me make sure I mentioned all the points I wanted to. Oh, man. Okay. Again, I think the general analogy to going to a movie, a theater, and viewing an animated movie. Okay? We're talking about existence in general, right? our life, existence in general. And what Hume's saying is, it is like an animated movie when we're in the theaters, right? With respect to the theater of life, existence is our experience is in fact, though it might seem fluid and like an animated movie, right? One long continuous experience. It's actually this distinct individual impressions that might be presented so often that just like the animated movie in the theaters we go to, might be presented so frequently, I should say, that they come across as being, again, one long continuous presentation, right? But they're not. It's not. Life isn't that way. It's not continuous. Right? So that is what we're supposing here, fallaciously, you might say, or at least without any good rational justification, is that, again, notion that our impressions are continuous. Okay? They're not. They're discrete, individual, distinct impressions. And so oftentimes, I'll make the mistake, sometimes even when talking about Hume, right, where I'm trying to point out what he's saying, I'll just automatically, right, draw in those, how we do, we connect the points in time, but that points in time, right? But that point in time, right, that's precisely what he's saying is the mistake. What we really have are just points. And so then, of course, why are they in this order, you might wonder? And he says, well, he famously says, all we are bundles of impressions. And again, I can't be sure of the order because I can't be sure 100% of what my memory tells me. Okay, think of Bertrand Russell again. How do I know that there wasn't an evil genius that didn't create me a moment ago thinking that all that stuff happened? All I can be certain of 100% is in fact what I'm perceiving right now, period. And I don't perceive a connection to any other impression in this individual impression. Okay. Now, where does space, because actually, and I've kind of, and some of what I've said, speaking about time, I've thrown in space already, but because it's kind of natural to combine these two. But where does space enter the equation then? So he says first it's natural to kind of, although not rational, right? It's completely natural. We do it all the time, but it's not rational, justified. To, again, suppose our impressions are continuous. Impose this idea of time on our experience. Okay? That's the first step. But the problem is there's this kind of psychological discord, if you will, that emerges because we kind of recognize what Hume's saying at times, right? Just like when someone explains it, we go, huh, that's interesting. The movie does appear, as if it's one presentation, but in fact, it's thousands of distinct images, right? So, thousands of distinct representations, okay? And so we understand that sort of thing, right? We kind of, in the back of our minds at least, not that we explicitly acknowledge it ever, it seems to be at odds at the same time, right? We understand and appreciate what Hume's saying in some sense, but then that obviously is at odds with what compelled us to suppose there was time in the first place, right? The idea, the sense in which it's the same sun, isn't it? It looks so similar, right? It must have continued to be there even when I'm not perceiving it. Right? We also have that sort of tendency. And so the psychological discord here then is what creates, although usually not explicitly ever, unless, it's a philosopher who's talking about this stuff, creates then this further supposition of space, okay? So it's an attempt, like psychological trickery, we don't understand, it's not how we understand it, right? And it's not how it would seem at first, right? But what he's saying is it's sort of mind games we play with ourselves constantly to help us feel better about this erroneous, constant imposition of our part of time. And well, let's explain this sense in which, we want to say things seem connected by saying, although it's not really able to be grounded in our actual impressions, which are not continuous, maybe there's this other realm this other kind of existence that's not ours, right? Because ours, again, we just have distinct impressions that aren't connected. Let's suppose that we're perceiving and representing something that exists outside of us that actually does continue to exist when we're not perceiving it. So even though, right, our impressions, it's true, are distinct, maybe we can explain better, accommodate that sense of time or connectivity by this idea of there being this other realm in which things are in fact connected, right? Can be connected. Okay, so to explain that incongruity with our own personal experience, the fact that our own experience as it is does not justify the idea that impressions are continuous, because they're not. Let's suppose that they can be continuous or indicative or represent something that is continuous to satisfy that intuition, this sense that there's something constant going on. Let's suppose that that happens outside of us, external to us. And again, you get this definition, like negative kind of definition. What is space? Or what do we mean to pick out by external existence? This idea that there is stuff out here. Well, it's what I'm not, right? Not my perceptions. What continues to exist independently of my perceptions of it. So it's what again, remove me. If I died, what would continue to exist? So everything I'm not. Okay. He's going to make the same kind of arguments though. Okay? So hopefully you can kind of see, or at least that's how he thinks it is, or why that is, that we also then, as he's going to say, imagine that there's space. Um, it's the same sort of psychological trickery at play, right? We have our experience as it is troubling. It doesn't seem to completely make sense, and aspects of it seem inconsistent. And so we automatically suppose these things because it seems to make things most comfortable, you might say. But again, our job is not to suggest what's most comfortable, because we do that naturally, as Hume concedes, but what makes the most sense rationally. And he's going to make the same sorts of arguments about space, okay, that apply to time. Now, all this goes on for everyone implicitly. Of course, rarely are we conscious of it, of course, but he's going to say this is what happens psychologically. But philosophers, of course, they make this more explicit. And he would say they don't actually question any of this. They just, they talk about it and argue as if this can somehow be rationally defended. And that's what he has a real issue with. Um, so, um, he suggests, a lot of these philosophers famously posit this notion of double existence. And this is implied, again, the whole idea of, so Hume famously calls it double existence. They make it explicit, the philosophers do, but it's the whole idea implicit in dualism, that there's two kinds of existence, right? There's existence as it appears to me, the subject, as I'm perceiving reality in my actual impressions of it. And then there's something out there, okay, that out, you call it space, something without, that also exists. And hopefully, the idea is, so that's also known as representationalism, right? The idea is what we're actually perceiving is in some sense merely representing what's actually out there. And science kind of suggests things along those lines. Again, we're perceiving a TV that's a certain color and making certain sounds, but really what's actually out there, it has a completely different kind of constitution, right? It's just wavelengths that are then affecting us in certain ways that's then the impression we have. Okay, so hopefully we're representing adequately for all those, most of us presumably, including most of the philosophers who advocate this idea of double existence. Well, hopefully then we're adequately representing what's actually out there. Most of the time it seems like we're not, as science tells us. What Hume's saying is we don't actually have, if you think about it, this is implied in your very concept of space, we don't actually have any impression of it, okay? Because the very idea of it is by definition, not what you're perceiving, right? Again, what you're perceiving is individual distinct moments that depend on you, right? You've never had an impression of something that continues to exist independently of you. Every impression of reality so far as you've ever known it, has hinged on your perception of it. This, right, this idea of space, what it means is what exists without your perception of it. But you have no perception of such a thing, Hume says, because literally everything you've ever known, every perception you had, was yours, right? So how do you know there is something besides you, or without, or external to your perception? So again, you don't actually have an impression of it. By definition, he would say. It's almost, I don't know, is it more easy, even easier to refute than time in some sense? I don't know, but you don't have an immediate impression, an actual impression of it by definition. And that was the reason why, right? We psychologically, we invent space. He would say, invent space and impose space, this idea of space on our experience in the first place. Okay, because we needed to better explain our tendency to project time on our impressions. But anyway, we don't have an actual impression of it, and so nor can we have a memory of having an actual impression of it, and it's not something we can come to rationally defend. Right? It's not something that seems necessary given our experience because we haven't even had an experience of it. So again, it must be something that we're just constantly imagining. That's what Hume suggests here. Okay. So I know there's a lot to digest here. I don't know how good of a job I did conveying this. Um, but again, I would just go back to then appeal to science. If this seems incredibly difficult to relate to or to grasp, or really no such thing as time, no such thing as space. Um, Again, reality isn't as it appears to us. Uh, you can't argue with that, can you? Even those of us that are most consider ourselves very scientific. Again, science is telling us the very same thing. Um, and so I would just implore you to think about what Hume has to say seriously, given that, right? If you're not immediately inclined to do so. And if you do that, well, the question then becomes, is he right, right? If we really do sit down and think about it, rationally, if you will, is it true that we don't actually have any impression of these two things, right? Space and time. I don't know. I mean, is this coming off the fence already? Maybe I shouldn't say whether I agree or not. Again, his position is we don't. Okay, we don't have an impression of either. Okay, for all the reasons we mentioned. Okay, and thus we can't have any memory of either. Okay, and I really like if you think about it in the sense that you can imagine things being otherwise. Give him his position, okay, that there isn't a connection, a connectivity between our impressions. Okay? Just suppose there's not. As much of a tendency as it is to think, that the needle and the pain are associated and connected necessarily. Imagine they're not. Okay, just suppose just give him his position and suppose that they're not, and give him his position that if you were to die, there wouldn't be anything that continue to exist independently of you. And he's going to say, your experience doesn't change one bit. Ergo, there's nothing necessary about time and space. Okay? You'll still have, whether you believe in them or not, you'll still have distinct individual impressions that always rely on you, so far as we've known. At least if your experience is like my experience, but maybe you're not actually out there. So I don't know, how would I know? And then how do I know that your experience? How can we ever know that our experiences are similar? maybe another episode as well. Okay, so keep in mind again, some of this is difficult to digest. Keep that science in mind. Keep the notions that the physicists are telling us, right? That there aren't TVs and books and red cars out there. There's just stuff congregated in certain areas, seemingly emanating various wavelengths, and we are wavelength processors. Is it all that hard to imagine that maybe we're also imposing on our experience of reality the notions of time and space as well? Well, what do I think? Let me get off the so-called philosophical fence. Oh, what a doozy. Shall I try again to draw my fence? I did not go well last time. Yeah, that's not going so well. We're going to stop there. Okay, first question. Perhaps the most important of all. Does my head hurt? I'm going to go with most definitely. Routinely. Okay. Nevertheless, right? I'm sure yours does too. Don't let that stop you from asking this stuff. Again, who said the truth didn't hurt? Maybe it's the case that ignorance is bliss. Maybe you do have to pick a path. Maybe thinking about this stuff is difficult. I don't know. Would you rather live a blissful life or know the truth? Or maybe that's a false dilemma. I don't know. But this stuff, regardless, at times is tricky, is difficult, and it does hurt your head. Okay? What do I actually think? Is there anybody out there? I should have left those options up there. Is there anybody or any bodies out there? And I'm going to go no. Rationally, logically, you're not out there. I mean, I can't know with certainty that you're out there. I don't know that you're out there. There's nothing necessary about supposing that you're actually out there. I can imagine. See, we always talk as if it's the weirder one is to suppose that you're not out there, right? But Hume seems to be arguing the opposite's actually the case, that we're more rationally justified in thinking, given that all of our experiences, the actual impressions give no indication, right, of them, that there's nobody out there, right? That nobody would continue to exist independent of us if we die, that they continue to exist. How do we know? We have no indication of a reality that has nothing to do with us, right? We've always been here for reality. Reality, as we know, depends on us. I mean, I agree with them, I think. Now, I don't know about the time then space thing. And it's been a long time since I actually dove in and really wrestled with that sort of stuff. So for your Humean scholar, if I messed up one or two things, or please forgive me. But the idea that time comes first and then space, I think there might be something to that. And I do agree that regardless, again, the general position that they both seem to be. I like the analogy again to the animated movie. In reality, we do seem to be processing things bit by bit in discrete. We have distinct impressions. They're distinct. At one point I have an impression of getting mad, and then something else makes an impression on me, and so forth. Yeah, I mean, I guess ultimately one way I looked at it in terms of which comes first, time or space. And then again, in general, I agree. We are sort of, I think, imposing. So that time, there's nothing connected. We have those discrete moments. Um, in space, again, everything we have an impression of, it depends on us. Okay. But what kind of has always aided me in terms of whether one is first, not always, but one thing I've kind of thought of recently, you know, um, does one come first, right? Do we naturally or psychologically suppose our impressions to be continuous? Time first, and then space comes. One thing that I thought about, and actually was one of my doodles here, I'm not going to leave this up there, but I don't know how well I can explain this either, but so the whole idea of 2D and 3D images, right? So time, space. So if you think about it, impression, okay? You have an impression of something, and again, just try to imagine that impression. You can freeze it in that moment. It's only going to be a 2D image. You can't have, again, I haven't fully fleshed this out yet, but it seems to me, this is the way I was thinking about it. It seems to me you can't have a sense of three dimensions, like a sense of width, right? Until you change positions, right? Or until you have then another distinct impression. That's going to require for you to have a change in position. It's going to require also another point in time, another distinct impression then, where you're viewing it from a slightly different angle, a different impression. Right? So to get that sense of space, which I think again is implied in this notion of three dimensions, I think again, maybe in some sense there is this sense of time already built into it, right? You needed at least two different moments or impressions, and then this notion that they're somehow connected to have then this idea of space or three dimensions in the first place. I don't know. I don't know how much this is making sense, how well I'm conveying this at least. Okay, just remember, science is telling us again, we're not actually, what's actually out there isn't the purple flower. It's some sort of bundle of something emanating a bunch of different wavelengths. Okay, maybe this becomes a little bit more relatable. Okay, I think that might be it. I guess one last off the fence, real quick. Let's go. Do I really, really, really think this? That there's nobody out there? Yes or no? Yes, from a rational perspective. If I have to pick a side, right? Of course, I'm going to qualify this just like I love to do. Yes, from a rational, logical perspective, I really, 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 really agree with Hume that I have no reason to think you're out there. Okay. But no, 99.9999999% of the time, I don't think this. Just like you don't. Just like 99.999% of us don't 99.999% of the time, because it's impossible, as Hume says. And it's impossible to suspend our disbelief in external existence. It's impossible to suppose for long that there's nobody out there. But nevertheless, as hopefully I've shown, it doesn't seem like I can rationally defend the idea that you're out there. And so you tell me, I guess, is there anybody out there?